All right, look, I think I've narrowed down what my top 10 games of the year are, and some of you are not going to be happy with my choices. I'm probably not going to be happy with my choices when I look back at this video 3 months from now, but I've made them, all right? So let's go over this. In all seriousness, though, even though 2020 itself has been basically one giant mess of a year, when it comes to games, there's actually been a lot of great stuff that's come out this year. So much so that when I kind of put together an initial list of all the stuff I really liked and needed to narrow down to 10, it was a lot more than I first anticipated. So I had to make some tough choices on what made it in and what didn't. As a result, there are some truly great games that just aren't going to get talked about because, for me, the other ones hit a little harder. Now, I am really bad at ranking things, which is part of why it took me so long to even figure out what my top 10 were. But on top of that, I'm not even going to rank these 1 through 10. I'll give you my top 3, I'll rank those in order, but for the first 7 games, let's just kind of talk about some games that I really loved this year, and we'll start with a really simple one, Doom Eternal. Doom 2016 is probably one of my favorite attempts at rebooting a major old school franchise, and Doom Eternal pretty much delivers on all the same places that 2016 did. This is a brutal and frantic first-person shooter that just breathes excitement and joy at all times, and it manages to even put a couple nice little spins on what 2016 did. One of the things I really liked about the whole Doom reboot is how it kind of kept alive the feeling of hiddens and secrets and collectibles from the old school games, and Doom Eternal leans even heavier into that by not only having cool little secrets to find, but also more collectibles you can pick up to unlock all kinds of other awesome in-game goodies, like alternate costumes. On top of that, though, it also increased the sense of kind of frantic speed in the game. Everything moves faster, you have more traversal options, and there's a lot more ways of quickly gaining back health and armor that you're losing just as fast by rushing headlong into a group of demons. There are a lot of different action titles on this list, but as far as the one game that really nails the most focused action gameplay experience goes, Doom Eternal is it. Now, Doom Eternal is probably not the most surprising game on this list, considering it was on a lot of different potential Game of the Year type lists from a lot of people, so let's get a little more in the weeds with something probably not as likely to see on a lot of lists, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2. I absolutely loved the original Curse of the Moon. I talked about it all the time. I always pushed it as one of those games where, for the price point it's at, you should just absolutely play it and give it a shot, and Curse of the Moon 2 is basically the exact same feeling for me and even more. In everything that I liked about Curse of the Moon 2 has expanded on even further. More characters to play as, redesigned larger levels with different multiple routes and pathways to take to go through them, new different mini games, different remixes of how you want to play through the game. There's just so much going on all in one little tiny retro love letter package that I just can't help but put it on one of my favorite games of this year. I know, there's all kinds of different big AAA games with fancy graphics and all kinds of fun stuff to talk about, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to something that just really nails the feeling of what was a fun game for me as a kid, but also being adapted to maybe being not as quite frustratingly difficult, or at least frustratingly difficult for the right reasons, this game absolutely nails that feeling. Inti Creates has done a really great job of kind of carving this niche out for themselves, of just bringing back that feeling of old school 2D platformers, and Curse of the Moon 2, to me, is probably their finest example of how they've just pinpointed that feeling so well. If you ever enjoyed any of the old Castlevania games, or even the later Castlevania games, and really any kind of 2D platforming action title ever, this is something you absolutely should give a look at, and if you haven't played this or the original, just pick them both up. They are so good. All right, let's go back to another high-profile game. This one is not in my top 3, but it is still one of my favorite games of this year. It's a bit of a contested choice for some people, but The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 is not a happy game. I say this because pretty much every other game on this list I feel like in some way gives me a degree of inspiration and joy out of playing it, and The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't really do that. Especially on the kind of year that it's been, it was a little bit of a downer to play, but it does such a great job of executing what I loved about the original Last of Us as well. It has a fantastic story to tell while having a solid third-person shooter game built into it that has a nice little bit of resource management added in as far as just trying to figure out what items you need to carry around and craft on the fly. The story just hits really well at all the right moments, and it made choices that clearly not everyone was happy with, but I personally thought was a great direction to take the series and really lived up to the spirit of what the original Last of Us was about. It's not really necessarily a story about heroes or overcoming some kind of major challenge, but it's really just about survival and getting by and just getting the different perspectives of people living in this dreary post-apocalyptic world. And 2 does a great job of inverting, I think, some of the perspectives people had after leaving the first game. It's not my Game of the Year choice, and it's not even my top 3 since I'm not actually saving it for that late in the video, but I'd be lying if I didn't say this game had a major impact on me and is one of my favorites of this year. Now, for something that is basically the complete opposite mood and tone-wise, Astrobot. This is a weird choice, I know, because it's a free game, pre-installed in the PS5, and there's a lot of other next-gen games that are not on this list that I'm sure some people are going to comment on missing, but I actually really felt the need to include Astrobot because of the fact that more than any other game that's currently out on a next-gen system, Astrobot sells me the most on what next-gen games can feel like. The visuals of it, the use it makes of the DualSense controller, not only in terms of things we've had before like motion controls, but also the haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers, it just does such an excellent job of showcasing what you can do game design-wise in the PS5, and it manages to do that while simultaneously being one of the best celebrations of PlayStation history. Something that I really appreciate about it is the number of references it makes to games that really have been an important part of PlayStation history that are not necessarily PlayStation exclusives. There are so many different games that it calls out to that were not released necessarily only on PlayStation, some of which didn't even originally release on PlayStation, but all have played a very important part of its history, and I love that it gives attention to all of those. Sure, it's not the longest or most complex game out there, but as far as the pure sheer joy that it gave me for the very low price tag of free included with my PS5, this is honestly a game that I think is going to leave one of the larger lasting impacts and really raises this kind of question to me of when can we see a more full-blown version of this? Because Astrobot is something that PlayStation has messed around with before, but it's always been kind of their tutorial game. And after playing this particular one on the PS5, I really want to see what a more grown-up, larger version of this could be. Next up is another one of the relatively smaller titles on this list, but it's one of the ones that is not only the best in its genre for this year, but really the best in its genre for probably the past decade, Streets of Rage 4. I have always loved the beat-em-up genre, and it's a genre that never has really gotten the full love that I think it deserves. There's been some great games here and there that have been released over time. There was a nice little boom of it at some point during the 360 life cycle with games like Castle Crashers and Scott Pilgrim, which thankfully we're getting back. But after those ones, there hasn't really been as many games released. And 2020 ended up being a surprisingly pretty good year for the genre between Streets of Rage 4 and Battletoads. Streets of Rage 4 manages to take the things that I love about the beat-em-up genre, but also remix it just a little bit and bring it a little more forward into the future. The combo system that's built into it, the visual style where it's this kind of 2D sketch drawing style look that I absolutely love, the music, even certain little things like being able to customize what different food pickup items look like. The cast of the main 5 characters, not including a bunch of nostalgia unlocks you can get, managed to all walk a great balance of being not only interestingly unique in design, but also handling pretty differently and having different ways of capitalizing on how they can build combos. The beat-em-up genre is one that I'm always looking forward to having more and more entries in, and Streets of Rage 4 is exactly what I think the genre needed, and I think it's going to be a tough one to top for quite a few years to come. Next, let's talk about another slightly weird situation with Cyberpunk 2077. I want to preface before I talk about why I like this game with the fact that all the criticism it has received for its bugs and for its messed up console launch and a lot of the features that were kind of talked about pre-launch that didn't end up being in the final version of the game, all of that criticism is 100% warranted, and it's a good thing it's being called out. But I still really like the game we ended up getting. I ended up spending most of my time on this on PC, which is the relatively most stable version of the game, and I've been personally pretty lucky as far as what bugs I've experienced. I've definitely experienced my share of them, but nothing that's really been absolutely game-breaking or a huge problem. The game absolutely has its flaws, but there's enough bones here of things that I really enjoy that I ended up walking away with a really solid mashup of GTA and Skyrim. The FPS elements and gunplay in it are amongst some of the better executed ones as far as FPS RPG hybrids go, and while the game's overall narrative does have its weak spots here and there are some individual moments in the game that are just pulled off so brilliantly well, as long as you didn't get any weird visual bugs at the same time to ruin the moment. A large part of the reason why this is able to be on the top 10 for me is because I just absolutely love open world RPGs. It's one of my favorite genres, and so even though Cyberpunk doesn't necessarily deliver as one of the best examples of that genre, it still brings a good core experience that I found really enjoyable. Now, admittedly, part of my hesitance about putting this one on the list isn't necessarily just the fact that, clearly there is some very warranted critiques about it right now, but also the fact that it is a game I am still currently very much enjoying. I'm over 100 hours and still actively playing, so there is that part of me that wonders if maybe 3 months from now, once I'm finally done with it, I kind of look back and go, I didn't really care about it that much. But as things stand right now in the middle of the end of 2020, I'm still completely in love with this game. Bugs and all. Then we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, while I'm not really ranking all these games up until the top 3, if anything was going to be a very strong contender for 5th or 4th top game for me this year, it's Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I'll admit right away that a large part of this is of course due to nostalgia, but that's also something I think the game did an excellent job of capitalizing on. It's not just simply a game that looked to remake a one-for-one version of the original, but instead tried to do something different and actively toys with the fact that it's a remake that they know people were looking for. So much so that I think some people who went into 7 Remake blind, never having played the original, missed out a lot of the kind of weirder things they decided to do narrative-wise. It's an extremely meta game in a lot of different ways. I'm not the biggest fan of how it necessarily ends. That's one of the things that I think pulls it back a little bit for me as far as being one of my top 3. But how it touches on different narrative elements over the course of the main storyline, but the way they sort of touch on this through different narrative moments in the main storyline, I really enjoyed. It's also, I think, Square's best execution thus far of trying to mix an action-adventure game with some of the more classic team turn-based elements that they had from their older titles. It has the same kind of core gameplay feeling as FF15, but it gives you a lot more justification for switching between characters. Each of them have their own unique feeling and approach and ways of handling different enemies, and it still manages to have just a little bit of customization and weapon choice in there that I really found to be a great decision. Again, I think there were a couple changes that could have happened, especially to the game's ending, that would have ended up having it take my game of the year, or at least come much closer to it. But even without those, even with what flaws it has, it's one of my absolute favorite releases of this year, celebrating one of my absolute favorite games that I grew up with. Okay, we got through the first 7 in whatever order you want to rearrange them in your head. For me, I don't care. But now we'll talk about my top 3 in order. And coming in at 3rd place is Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost is one of those games that in a lot of ways doesn't really do anything to reinvent any of the major conventions we're used to seeing in a lot of games right now, especially when it comes to the kind of open world action genre that it's a part of. But it manages to fine-tune and perfectly execute so many aspects of it that I'm completely okay with that fact. You know, a lot of times when there's a game that's meant to emphasize stealth elements, I feel like actual combat sometimes gets left to the wayside because, you know, the goal is not to get caught or to kill enemies without getting caught, whatever. And Ghost abandons that particular issue, instead favoring having really cool stealth mechanics to begin with that are then balanced out with even better combat as far as being able to execute all kinds of cool combos, countering enemies, making use of a variety of different special tools. It just all comes together as this fantastic execution of its core combat. Add on to that its beautifully designed landscapes, its music that does an excellent job of accentuating the game's more dramatic moments, and overall having a great story accompany the gameplay. This is one of those games where it's just hard for me not to list any higher. Again, it doesn't necessarily do anything to reinvent the wheel, but it does a really, really good job of perfecting it. Coming in at number 2, my second most favorite game of this year is Yakuza Like a Dragon. Now, part of the reason why this one's ranking as high as it is because I think, in a very big way, this was probably one of the biggest surprises for me this year. A lot of these other titles we talked about were things that I was looking forward to. They were franchises I was familiar with, stuff that I kind of knew what I was getting. With Yakuza, it's a series that I've never been able to fully get into. I've given Yakuza 0, 2, and 1 a couple different tries, and every time it just fails to grab me in the long run. And Like a Dragon had the very opposite effect. I started playing this game and immediately fell in love with it. I know we don't talk about games themselves super often on this channel, usually favoring more hardware and gaming tech, but when I've talked about games, I usually lead on to the fact that I'm a really big fan of RPGs, especially old school ones, and Yakuza draws a lot of clear inspiration from these older titles, even referencing them within its own storyline, into this just very ridiculous modern-day take on that genre. Now, to be honest, the execution of the core mechanics as far as being a turn-based RPG is fine. It's really not the shining moment of this game, but it's having that basic concept in there crammed into this gigantic game in terms of tons of different side quests to do and mini games and just accompanying this ridiculous story that somehow manages to be over-the-top silly and yet also very serious and dramatic at times with some of the biggest emotional gut punches I've had out of a game this year. It just all works together so well. And there's a lot of things about the game that I could objectively call out as being some of its weak points. The enemy encounter rate is very awkward, the XP curve is all over the place. It definitely has its problems as far as just being designed as a game, but as far as the lasting impression it has had on me, the kind of joy that it brought me, and how hard the storytelling actually ended up hitting, I have to rank this game as high as I have. And lastly, my number 1 game of the year, which probably doesn't come as a surprise because it's been sitting behind me this whole time I've been talking about other games, and if you happen to follow me on Twitter, I haven't stopped talking about it this entire year, is Hades. I have been a longtime fan of Supergiant Games ever since their first release of Bastion. Is just one of those companies that I am constantly waiting on and looking forward to seeing what they do next, because I think they are some of the best examples of games that, to put it lightly, have no wasted energy. Music, voice acting, art direction, narrative, game mechanics, there is not really any aspect of this game that I feel like is an individual weak point. And when it comes to game design, most of their titles, Hades being no exception to this at all, feels as if there's not really such a thing as a unnecessary or superfluous mechanic. Everything plays into the core game experience, which in this case is doing an over and over again gameplay loop of trying to escape the underworld. The roguelike genre is one that's always been a little bit of a love-hate thing with me. There are some roguelikes that I absolutely adore, and other ones that I just never really had clicked with me, even the ones that are really popular. And something that Hades does to that genre that I feel like no other game has really ever properly done is having a proper story told at the same time. Usually the mechanic of getting as far as you can before dying and then restarting, maybe with some more extra buffs, isn't something that leads to traditional storytelling, but Hades manages to do that by actually making that a core part of how the story is told. Every time you try to make an escape, whether it's successful or not, you still end up right back where you started, and the storyline moves forward in terms of the relationships you form with the game's various NPCs. At the same time, even once you've finished the main storyline or even exhausted all the conversation topics you can find with all the game's different characters, there's still reasons to just keep playing over and over again because the core combat feels that satisfying. The kind of upgrades and benefits you can get, the way each different weapon you can pick up handles differently, everything just all feeds together into this core experience that is so utterly addictive. I mean, I've played a lot of different roguelikes and sunk some decent time into them. None of them have kept me as engaged for as long as I have been with Hades. There have been a lot of great games this year, and like I said at the top of this video, I had trouble picking which 10 I really wanted to have on this list. But even with the great ones that I've left off and the great ones that did make this list, at the end of the day, I will say the one thing I have no hesitation about saying and choosing is that Hades is my absolute favorite game of the year. I'm like right at the close, and there's like 3 trains, 2 trucks, and people talking loudly downstairs. Why? Anyways, that's my top 10 list. I feel like I'm probably going to look at this a couple months from now and then be like, oh, maybe I should have included this instead of that. Whatever. I feel pretty good about what I've chosen for today. Let me know down below in the comments what your favorite games this year are, whether it's your singular number 1, your top 3, top 5, top 10, whatever. Let me know down below in the comments, and I will see you guys later. Maybe with another video this year. I don't know. We'll see. We'll find out.